Hello everyone, today we talk about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, our regular uploads about the war that we started this year. So far I updated the situation just every couple of months. Fundamentally, this is not, of course, mandatory. You could make more or less videos about this. You have positively received my previous content on the subject. This is essentially a broader strategic analysis that, however, Clausewitzianly speaking, is always rooted in the politics of it all, and so the general international situation all across the board, right? Today's video is quite particular because even though you know that I'm biased in favor of Ukraine, or at least I've always proclaimed, of course, my support to the country, I've made it always on my channel a point to be as historically accurate and objective as possible, right? I have, of course, detractors that say, oh no, Schwerpunkt. Here about Ukraine, not much. Nobody really attacked me because of this. Of course, at some point, people have their own ideas. They can say whatever they want, but online, like in the past years, people, especially on Reddit, that do not quite take well my ideas on authority, et similia, contest the without any actual object of discussion, actually, and not because I'm belittling it, but because, when you should say, well, this thing is wrong, you should say even what you're talking about, actually, because there isn't actually much of that. And I care to stress this because this attitude informs all my content. And I would actually argue that the more important the content is, and the more I feel like that I need to be accurate. It's not just method. It's not just a matter of honesty, regardless of the fact that, humans are of a fallen kind. You're always dishonest in some way, and nothing can be true 100%. But of course, I on Schwerpunkt, I think, made it, a point enough in the several years of this channel's existence that the difficulty in understanding reality have nothing to do with the weird notion that at some point existed, especially in the liberal circles, in this sort of always, relativizing context that the more you know, the less you know. This is absolutely not true. The more you know, at most, the more you realize how few you know, but not necessarily in the sense that what you know is not actually way more solid. And there isn't such a thing like intellectual development based on skepticism, per se. You do come to change your mind in front of evidence. You do sort of grow up in that sense. And so mostly in the awareness that you in history, especially, always a step away from a mind, right? But overall, of course, I think this is the value of the channel and how I've developed it. I've continued to work on it in parallel with my medievalist, military historian work. Now, when it comes to Ukraine, in the past episodes, we have stressed the essentially many theoretical aspects of this that are not abstract aspects. They are properly grounded on the evidence that we have about this war, and war also in a theoretical sense. Speaking about the same von Krieg and all what we can sort of appreciate from a comparative and diachronic military historical analysis. No war is the same, but the foundational principles of warfare are the same, and in this sense, reality in its imperfection pivots around them. Like a bad way of explaining it, von Clausewitz is much more refined in definition. And one of the most important aspects of this war was the fact that since the beginning that we wouldn't really see an end to it. Obviously, every war must end at some point, but that, of course, in relative terms to the possible outcome in a broader political international sense, the matter has been much more complicated than other wars, for reasons that I will not digress on. They're kind of obvious. We're essentially looking at a nuclear power and a country that namely had sort of the second military force in the world, talking conventional terms, that basically got bogged down in a war that they completely failed at starting to begin with, and that for political reasons, obviously, they had to continue, together with losses that are essentially unsustainable, right? This we've seen is true for both Ukraine and Russia. Like, the thing continues, because some definitions may be confusing to people who think that warfare is basically there is one guy who wins and one guy who loses, simply, as opposed to they may both lose, as a matter of fact, or one may lose but sort of get a better deal, say losing in certain military terms. Things are really complex and complicated. We explained very much and at length the fact that Russia is actually not, like in exactly as it happens, in fact, in Goliath and David's clash, the preferred winner, just because it's bigger and, in this sense, apparently more powerful in the offensive. There is a scale of this war, the sort of political identity of Ukraine, the statehood deriving part from the same, inherited from the same Soviet legacy. There are sort of many different aspects here that show not necessarily a particularly symmetrical conflict at all, because obviously not just Ukraine is sort of much smaller in this sense, but war is by definition asymmetrical. Whoever thinks that there is such a thing like symmetrical warfare is completely lost in some sort of Gnostic and nominalistic heresy, completely detached from the definition of what warfare is and how it is actually fought. The main problem with a nuclear power that is essentially contrasted by other nuclear powers supporting Ukraine, that evidently has a chance to win. Otherwise, von Clausewitz explains very well, like, they would have simply thrown it under the bus since the beginning. There is a beautiful passage in the Funkriege about the partitions of Poland that, of course, from a Prussian perspective, were actually a thing. And von Clausewitz, he would actually die during one of the Polish uprisings, but he has a very actually very sensitive approach to that, and he makes it mostly just a military point. That is to say, if there is such a thing like, and this is the Polish example at the time, like a country that cannot defend itself, right, so cannot win a war on its own, at that point, not just it's taken over, but their allies would also participate in its partition. Now, it's not a mystery, especially from the last weeks, even though I must say that at least where I live, the picture is not clearly understood, right? At least media have from quite a while, especially since the debatably failed, in absolute terms at least, Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2023 sort of distanced themselves a bit from the picture, in part because the war of attrition has been going on without any significant change, right? And even the Russian accomplishments of Pokrovsk in the that are still in theory, and Pokrovsk is lost in any case, to them, do not significantly change as a broader picture, right? There isn't, even at the moment, any indicator that Russian armed forces are even remotely close to be able to carry out such things like a breakthrough or whatever. The state of Ukrainian forces, however, is what should draw sort of the most alarming interest from the side of the Allies and from the side of those who really have the power to intervene in the situation, also in a domestic sense, not just in a military one, but in a wholly political fashion. And I'm not a politologist, so I'm not making this video because I'm suggesting what Ukraine and its government should or shouldn't do. My point is documenting here. I mean, in a way, we can talk about it. I can't express my opinion about that, but say what I'm interested in here is to observe how this, of course, directly affects the war in a clause of in the famous adage that is not just an adage, that, of course, war is a continuation of politics with other means, all right? And the current situation is different, right? After mid-23, the fall of 2023, our understanding was that for Ukraine, a moment of protracted vulnerability would open, right? Simply because, and we partially discussed it in the previous episodes, that there are certain structural capacities that can't, still to this day, under some aspects, some were sort of actually gapped, right? But it couldn't be, in fact, created ex novo, if not on a fairly long-term period, right? There has been a matter of mostly a political problem in recruitment. It's not much the fact that there is a collapse of the Ukrainian people, or that they're technically running out of manpower. That's not how it works in a merely absolute sort of material numerical sense. The problem is deeper. The problem is political, is moral. And it's not to say that the Russians haven't had similar problems. They are different, right? But as we should of course focus, like in the West, on Ukrainian defensive capacities, because the overall strategy, at least the bigger picture, in the moment, it's not just dictated by the strength ratios, but obviously is something which benefits Ukraine, at least in terms of the aforementioned also absolute material losses. We have distracted a bit ourselves from the Russian perspective. It is definitely not a better one, not a more positive or idyllic, or I don't know if you have seen the pictures of what could be called an army entering Pokrovsk. It's essentially post-apocalyptic kind of scenario, right, where these guys, entering motorcycles, scatter like that. By the way, what is perplexing about those images is there should be drones bombarding them as they are advancing in the open, aside from the fact that mostly happening in the mist, which also Ukrainians, in their own kind of way, they had to say in a way that the Russians had entered Pokrovsk from quite a while. And I'm not here even to expose the propaganda of both sides, because first of all, that my concept of propaganda is very neutral. I mean, propaganda simply comes from Latin and means those things that must be propagated. And so any judgment regarding what these things are, whether they're true or not, whether it's a completely different thing, propaganda is very important and it should be made. The question is that, of course, the media very often just flash certain information that is basically and almost useless, especially in the eyes of those who actually know what things are really like. Those people who say, "Oh, well, you don't know what it's really like on the field," or also because as if they knew, but as if they were there themselves, or even being that individual soldier over there actually gave you a better insight of what is happening on the whole picture, which is really never been the case in any war per se, unless you do for other reasons. I'm talking in particular things such as the alleged deal between America and Russia that was flashed by the news. In fact, just recently said, "Oh my God, the U.S. are secretly negotiating." quote unquote secret negotiation. It's something that normally happens all the time. Everybody knows it, and it's kind of a game. Yeah, you have the military telling the executive what was going on. Politics in this sense informs like what can be a position that certain mediators, there are specific officials in a closed room literally toy with people, their correspectives on the other side by offering things that can be even absurd, just to test essentially the psychology, the political will, the cultural shades of the other side. And secret negotiations happen all the time. These are the things that specifically are not told to you, just like, our secret services do not tell you what your state does. It's completely normal. It must be like that. Otherwise, there wouldn't be secret services. They wouldn't do what they need to do. The point is that if you look at the political and strategic fundamentals of this war, regardless of the fact that Russia is really tired as well, still do not account for the reason why it's tired, and so the motivation, the determination from both sides to continue this war. Today, we talk about this sort of less sort of flattering and more sobering aspects of the Ukrainian situation, because it is painful to say, but as you've seen also in the previous video, it's not like I'm withholding any information, is really something new. in the picture. I mean, at the level of deterioration of the Ukrainian armed forces, this is something we haven't really seen so far. And I'm just talking about the current situation of the Ukrainian armed forces in general. The army, obviously, for obvious reason at most. Aerial things are also pretty disconcerting in a broader sense, but there is also a civilian reason for that. The main issue, however, being that there is a political problem, which is much more serious by definition than any military problem, and that is hitting Ukraine harder than the military losses that the Ukrainian people still has made incredibly clear, regardless, for example, of the unprecedented levels of desertion at this point, that they are willing to take, right? What they're not willing to take and what they're fleeing from the battlefield is the result of an incredibly compounded problem that has to do, and I say it without any sort of contempt, but the obvious reality, what was always known by everyone at any point, that of course Ukraine, also because of its Soviet past, is of course a corrupt country, is of course a country with lots of problems, and while in post-socialist world, it is of course like Russia in many ways is much worse at a much bigger scale in that sense, also in a social-cultural one, in fact, and they're not equivalent to one another. But that tends to sort of erode a very particular post-socialist almost excuse that is very dangerous in this case, that is to say, namely, the elites are corrupt. Right, and so instilling, regardless of the possible participation of other strata of the population, the fact that, which naturally a very pressured population, naturally a very, suffering population, tired one, but again, one that could well continue fighting, where there's certain internal premises that definitely contrast with one of today, and they will continue fighting for that matter, but will suffer, in fact, of the such conditions to the point of endangering the stability of the same armed forces. This is like it's not a far-fetched conclusion in the sense that, again, this war must end at some point, and the possibilities at this point of how it's going to end are still open. Right, we haven't arrived at a critical collapse moment. We have arrived, however, what appears to be a significant weakening of the cohesion of the Ukrainian armed forces that will, by some degree, oblige Ukraine to withdraw from specific areas at an unprecedented speed. Not much under an overwhelming Russian pressure, but rather certain gaps, certain holes that are forming within the armed forces, because the aforementioned corruption, mismanagement, etc., is unfortunately deeply seated in the current, let's say, handling of these, of these branches of government, and are really endangering again the Ukrainian cause in this war as well. It's a very complicated topic because these things were always there, and so this doesn't take away the fact that, again, Ukrainians fought particularly well, and this is, I think, really undeniable under any circumstances. But they fought well as a people, not because they couldn't do even better had they been properly and say better led than what especially Zelensky's sort of direction would eventually push, especially from late 2022 and 2023, bringing, as you know, to basically the destitution of Zelensky, the sort of the apparent metastasization of a specific modus operandi that also, in fact, does not take into consideration much the human sacrifice, like probably the manpower losses that could be avoided with a sort of better, more advanced, more responsible, more intelligent, more competent, more authoritative handling of the war. The truth is that nor Russia nor Ukraine at this point have a winning strategy per se, right? They could keep going on destroying each other, destroying each other, like mostly again in Ukraine, but also, as you know, with all the sort of things that tends to blow up and burn in Russia. That is not, however, how in practice Ukraine can simply win, right? But just hoping to sort of add to the fatigue from the Russian side. So by November 2025, Ukraine is experiencing a convergence of, we could define, three existential crises of unprecedented and simultaneous intensity since the opening months of the full-scale invasion. So from one side, we have a rapidly deteriorating front line, marked by the worst rates of soldiers leaving their post without authorization and accelerating Russian territorial gains, and as a consequence, in previously stable sectors. So this is a problem properly of the broader rear, right? This is a counter problem. This is not a problem how it's also a problem of how Ukrainians are being sent to fight and die in a strictly military sense, but from positions that in this sense could be held successfully in the previous years, as we've seen, with this concerning amount of losses from both sides. Like, of course, in a broader sense, Russia as defender suffers more losses, but Ukraine possibly suffered even other in terms of just sheer pounding of the sort of Russian, for example, FABs, like sort of bombardment superiority and so on. There are, as we'll see now, some shifts also in the we've seen it also in the previous video of this series, like the gradual intensification of Russian aerial capacities, mostly through drones, because again, aviation is there, but is, as you know, since the beginning of the war, really not used after the major losses of both sides that don't render it, at this point, at this proper level of operation, a necessity. The Institute for the Study of War, that, as you know, is particularly in favor of Ukraine, assesses that Russian forces have achieved tactically significant advances in the Pokrovsk direction through a combination of prolonged battlefield air interdiction campaigns degrading Ukrainian ground lines of communication, in other words, the supply routes, tactical interdiction, and infiltration missions exploiting poor weather and gaps in drone coverage, enabling small groups to bypass strong points and create sub-pockets for encirclement without large-scale mechanized assaults. Right? An energy infrastructure entering winter in a state of near-total vulnerability after years of warnings and diverted protective contracts, and a corruption scandal that is, it's been quite loudly sort of echoed in the media in the last week. In fact, of historic scale, directly implicating President Zelensky's closest pre-political circle that detonated precisely when the population most needed confidence that the state was doing everything possible to shield it from the cold and the darkness. So you understand that both at the political and military level, things are not good for Ukraine, and that especially what appears here is not much a lack of resource, but a heavy mismanagement that hits in a deeply moral sense before then a strictly material one, the entire mechanism, and that ends up also in a material sense, of course, to create these gaps that eventually equate to literally, the Russians simply advancing, not finding essentially enough resistance for them to stop and taking advantage of that. Again, the Russian army is not in the condition here, even after the take of Pokrovsk, of getting anywhere with this in a quick sense, unless Ukrainians themselves decide, in fact, to withdraw and to do things in a bit more of a strategically sound sense at that point, because this was being basically the leitmotif of this war. The Russians do not know when to stop attacking, the Ukrainians do not know when to stop defending, right? And this is being disastrously consequential for the both of them, albeit in different ways, but still, all right? I mean, Pokrovsk's still sort of the few houses in the hands of Ukrainians at this point really have brought to things like, for 50 meters of advance, 1,200 Russian casualties. When I say that these rate of losses is not sustainable. It's not much like saying these guys do not know they can't sustain it, but they do, right? This is literally informing like the entire course of the war, in the sense that also Russia is evidently desperate here to gain any kind of tangible result, mostly for domestic reasons. The Russians, of course, do not let us know as much as we know, for example, ourselves about Ukraine. That is also a secretive country, a bit in the same style, but obviously is much more connected to a wider net and has sort of much greater visibility in all its kind of elements. That's why the aforementioned scandal is important, because for a country that is going to join the EU and is going to be fully integrated within the West, of course, this is a problem of image that hits hard, not much, I think, at the Westerners, but the Ukrainians themselves, because they are proud people, and most of them are definitely intending, sort of well predisposed towards the entire process, regardless of the enormous confusion, the stress, the losses, the suffering. The fact that for them, like the West, a bit like for the Russians, it's up to a few years ago in their case specifically, it's something relatively known. You can understand that they are obviously distrustful. This is typical of any, again, mostly post-socialist countries. It's probably a very specific and defining social cultural reality. Also, if you've of course lived Ukraine, and your ancestors during the Soviet Union, that's simply something that self-evidently defines the entire worldview and existential guise, so to say. But this is even more painful for them, of course, since they really rely, in that sense, on their government to navigate them to safer waters. And at this point, struck at probably at the need to fight. These people have been demanded an enormous sacrifice, and that's why the scandal amplifies the moral consequences of itself. This scandal erupted on November the 10th with the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, the NABU's announcement of a 15-month investigation involving 70 searches and 1,000 hours of wiretaps, leading to the detention of 5 suspects, including the head of security at the state nuclear operator Energoatom, a former energy ministry advisor, and 3 money launderers, and charges against 7 individuals, with Zelensky stripping Mindich of Ukrainian citizenship on November the 16th and appointing a new Energoatom supervisory board by November the 23rd to oversee an urgent audit of procurement. So I will suspend any judgment regarding Zelensky, because honestly, say, as a wartime figure, I think he did what he had to do in many ways. But this is not, I personally, for example, don't have I don't know, personally, I don't vibe with this guy. I don't think I would like him as a person, in person, but that's not what I'm evaluating. I suspend any judgment mostly on the fact that it's obvious that in this circumstance, he bears part of the responsibility of this all. Some would more openly say, because he's corrupt himself, and there is a great use of this wording at this point a bit all over the world. When you look at the elites, when you look at governments, if you look at the EU, if you look at whatever, like the government, even now the section of MAGA that tries desperately to backstab Trump vying for power. Different situations. Here again, I'm not judging Zelensky. I'm not into the. I don't know better than what most people would like to know about this. So I will pass judgment also to future developments. In any case, EU leaders, including Finnish President Alexander Stubb, have urged swift accountability, while pledging continued support amid fears the affairs could jeopardize Ukraine's EU accession path and further erode donor confidence in Kyiv's governance, which has been since the beginning the whole point of this. Like, the EU was very clear to the Ukrainians when saying that their country has to change in many ways. Of course, the financial handling, aside from the war at this point, that of course opened certain sort of crevices that where we see here corruption has proliferated. But this was obvious. It's not because of Ukraine in particular is corrupt. There are so many corrupted countries. I mean, look at Russia. But say here we're not making ideologism, and even less against Ukraine. But it's obvious that there is something about the reaction that same Ukrainians could have to this by saying, or we would really like to join. We would really like to have, I don't know, in this moment more than ever, the idea of a safe, etc. And even though there are much sort of more important problems to solve than EU accession standards, for sure, this is yet another sort of big boulder on the moral condition of the Ukrainians to take under all the pressure that have been throughout these years. Now, because that's, I think, the most important thing. It's not much what, again, I don't know, Berlin or Paris think about this. At some point, the reasons why the West supports Ukraine are not going to be eroded by because there is even, I don't know, a corrupted government in Ukraine. This was not really a mystery for everyone at any point throughout all these years. The point is how Ukrainians themselves are going to take this, even just by the vibes that this sparks, compounded with the ones of battlefield fatigue and despair, with not desertion and essentially give up mentality. We'll talk later about, I read some posts. Essentially, there are two main philosophies that we have heard so far, and there are so many different sub-currents of this, but from one side, you have, also unofficial, if you want, and obviously consistent statement, like if you look at Dragone's words, for example, a couple of weeks ago, that is properly, again, NATO, the West as such, and their military expertise, that, of course, Russia has lost the war. This is something I personally said at the moment in 2022. The Russians stepped in, right? And as I reiterated at the beginning of this video, you can't have both countries being defeated in this war. The Russians have already lost for all a series of reasons that are maybe difficult to understand for those who think that for some reason Russia has this enormous power capacity, and so we'll leave those people living in a dreamland. But there are much more evident to the Russians themselves, and it's not like from the beginning of the war I haven't talked to some Russians that I've known, and they, while of course they always share this ambiguity with the notion that in any case they are under the system, they can't escape it, and so it's better just to go on. So basically letting it happen, right? We're not, taking the mask off, saying that they're actually supporting the whole thing, which happens too oddly frequently with Russians. That's kind of apparently schizophrenic, passive-aggressive attitude that they force themselves into. And which is valid, but does not, as a narrative, but does not address how Ukraine is supposed to win, which we know how it's supposed to win and to basically stand her ground and remaining an independent country and an intact one. It would be enough for the Russians, in a sense, to just destroy Ukrainian statehood rather than properly winning or taking. The Russians do not even want to take over the entire territory of Ukraine. Ideally, they would like to do that, but it's not exactly what they can simply afford to do, especially with such an enormous country that would, in any case, remain populated and create enormous issues at home and beyond. Or getting, of course, further outrage from the international community and such. Then there is another current that is, I must say, within the sort of pro-Ukraine support tends to be a bit more liberal. I'm talking people like Tom Cooper, that literally defines himself as an atheist, that has as such, like, he supports Palestine, or what that is supposed to be, by the way, and he's quite bitterly complaining about it all the time. And again, the guy is made like that, right? But a defining characteristic of atheists is, first of all, ungratefulness and this tendency to eventually delirate to some sort of leftistic conspiracy where basically everybody's corrupt, everybody's bad because capitalism bad or whatever. I don't know whether the guy, is properly a leftist or not, but let's say he sounds pretty sort of too ubiquitously relativistic regarding criticism regarding corruption in a broader sense. Like Ukraine can win the war even as a corrupt country. That's not the point. The point is interpreting the actual situation, the actual condition. I estimate Cooper for his knowledge and his competence. I'm not saying that. And I know more than him as a whole, but and this happens very often. Like I'm in my own way. I'm a military analyst by profession myself, and let's say it takes, some kind of wisdom in also assessing, especially the situation of an ongoing war. And certain affirmation from the guy sounds a bit too tranchant. In any case, he collects essentially. I was referring to him when I said everybody is corrupt, Ukraine, the EU, whatever, and provides with posts from same Ukrainians saying things like, "Told you, I'm not the only one who says that." And these Ukrainians are actually complaining about the aforementioned problems, the fact that the front could, in theory, collapse. Again, we're not in front of indicators that tell us that the front could collapse as we intend the collapse of a front like a breakthrough. No, we're talking something significantly more messed up, where the Russians do not have that capacity, and they're, again, far from getting any of that. The point is naturally realizing the unprecedented level of Ukrainian, essentially, deterioration, and the apparently accelerating trend that we're witnessing to now, right? These problems actually were all there from quite a while, especially from several months, but at this point they seem to have been accelerating. It's not the collapse of a front, but it's definitely the weakening of it to the point of requiring a strategic not just assessment, but possible redeployment, and so withdrawal from particular areas in favor of the Russians, where most of the war in Donbass has been fought along the chain of the greatest stronghold fortresses of that area, that essentially the Russians have taken just like the first line of, and seem pretty far from getting sort of any of the latter. But in fact, it's not even that belt of fortresses that matters. What matters here is how you can essentially stabilize their supply, you can guarantee that they're properly defended, and so on. And in fact, at this point, as we will see now, it's mostly the Zaporizhzhia front at this point that is really creating more issues, also for kind of obvious reasons. Less troops there. Also a huge, again, like in those areas of Ukraine, a huge in-between with really very scarce, resources and again, material gains that, however, may, say, as a simple route of advance could strategically instead have great implications, because the Russians could, at that point, logorate the aforementioned belt defenses from a more rare position in a very sort of attritional sense, not in the sense they can simply outflank them at this point. Now, going back on the corruption scheme centered on the Ministry of Energy, that is very important because Ukrainians, as you know, suffered a great deal of energy, like a power outage, and they spent sort of winter to some degree in cold, rationing electricity in other times of the year, also in summer and so on. So it's all a very striking and painful scandal. There is also the state nuclear operator Energoatom, again, that is all one with that as a nuclear, powered counter from within centrals, where contractors, this was the thing, were obliged essentially to pay kickbacks of 10 to 15% of any contract value, essentially, laundering approximately $100 million in wartime resources, explicitly earmarking for the population's physical survival in winter, right? $100 million is a lot, right? Even if you consider in arms, the aid has been sent, this is enormous. It's big. It's just like losing a major battle on the field, especially from a moral point of view. Some funds reportedly reached even the same Moscow via entities linked to pro-Kremlin figures such as former MP Andriy Derkach. Directly implicated individuals include several deputy ministers, senior ministry officials, and especially Alexander Timur Mindich, a founding member of Zelensky's Kvartal 95 entertainment group, who fled to Austria in summer 2025 and later to Israel, as well as the businessman Alexander Zuckerman. Both are now under personal sanctions imposed by Zelensky himself. The former energy minister, German Hermann Halushenko, widely regarded as compromised for over a year, was protected until transferred to the Justice Ministry in July 2025 and finally resigned on November the 12th amid the probe. Despite 2 years of Ukrainian and Western specialist warnings, none of the critical defensive measures were implemented. That is to say, the centralization of distribution, we're talking energy here, of course, distributed generation capacity, second and third level protection of transformer stations and turbine halls, leaving substations almost completely unprotected, and the diverted contracts now perceived as deliberate betrayal, endangering millions of lives amid renewed massive Russian strikes. That's how big this is, and how big this is for Ukrainians. Again, as Westerners, we can't look at this and say, well, okay, this is a big deal, it's huge, but we're bombarded with other news, and people don't give a damn because they don't even understand what's going on at large. But for Ukraine, this is something incredibly hard to digest. Energoatom, which supplies over half of Ukraine's electricity via 3 nuclear plants, exploited martial law rules to block contractor payments unless kickbacks were paid, with the scheme extending to the defense ministry. Public outrage has intensified as daily blackouts, exactly at this point of escalation of Russian attacks that are obviously aimed at exploiting the political crisis, and now routine, right, due to, in fact, these attacks destroying 80% of thermal capacity, coincide with a scandal, prompting Zelensky to declare on November the 16th that, quote, the president of a country at war cannot have friends, right? So this naturally means something like of a sort of confession of guilt in his inner circle. He also vowed full accountability, while analysts warn that this whole matter risks Ukraine's 50 billion Ukraine facility aid tied to anti-corruption reforms, which is naturally a great lifeline for Ukraine sort of reconstruction and infrastructural rebuilding and stepping up, even just as a country in general, not just afterward, but also in the meanwhile. Now, the investigation was conducted by the post-2014 NABU and the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, the SAPO, heavily funded and ideologically shaped by the West. This aspect is incredibly important for one reason, because you would expect, these are Ukrainians, right? This is something slightly different, because this is basically directed by foreign powers, right? So it's the West that actively carried out this investigation through, of course, Ukrainians, because these are, chapeau to them for their work and also sort of their courage, given, again, the non-sort of idyllic conditions, not just of the country at war, but, I mean, if you are fighting against a corrupted government, you may want to look your back at some point. And so there is an aspect, because this anti-corruption office is formally independent, yet often accused of wielding investigative material as political leverage in Ukraine as well. So the scandal's timing coinciding with the resumption of systematic Russian attacks on the Greek weeks before real winter has fueled speculation of course, external calibration to force profound personnel or policy changes in Kyiv, which may even obviously come as a good thing, all in all. Like, it could be like a wake-up call And you would think, but in war, given also this much resources that were essentially lost and even were arrived to the same Kremlin, sort of gave that blow that you're talking about, morally speaking. Yes, but it's better to have such trauma and addressing, the consequences, taking responsibility and trying to change something could really be the tip of the balance during the war itself than remaining in the course of this terrible dynamic. Zelensky announced a full overhaul of state energy companies, including new management at Energoatom, and called for dismissals, yet opposition and even deputies from his own Servant of the People party now demand the government's resignation and focus anger on Andriy Yermak, the universally acknowledged second most powerful figure and the de facto decision maker in domestic, foreign, and some military matters even. On November the 18th, as the scandal peaked, Yermak traveled to London amid reports of contacts with former Commander-in-Chief Valery Zaluzhny, currently ambassador to the United Kingdom, and that's a very good position and thing, by the way, for him to be there, and still leading, in fact, popularity polls. You know the whole story, that the guy is actually like the most capable commander at that level that Ukraine could have, and he was deliberately removed by Zelensky and his his party, so to say, in order to appoint, in fact, sort of some favorites that are responsible for the very bloody handling of the war and the lack of an actually comprehensive strategic handling of the same. I talked about Zaluzhny. I started, of course, like the series just this year, so he was already away. But we talked about sort of also the strategic insight of this man, of what happened in the fall of 2022. Some say that war could be stopped then had the Ukrainians counterattacked in Zaporizhia, not in Donbass, right? So that's a completely sort of now also irrelevant debate. But in general, like there is something big regarding the military handling of the war. There is not merely Ukraine understood as a monolithic block of, that there is just so much they can do. War is always, as we explained before, asymmetrical, and so there is always so much you can do that can obtain some very specific results. This counterposition, also the British treasuring of Zaluzhny, prompted speculation of scenarios from palace coup even to negotiated exit with immunity guarantees. Now, the political composition of Zelensky's innermost circle, almost exclusively old Kvartal 95 colleagues and personal friends from university or earlier, has systematically privileged decades-long loyalty over competence in the most sensitive posts, a mechanism that initially enabled a rapid consolidation of power, and so bringing even some temporary political stability, but has now become the system's fatal weakness. Right. In this sense, Zelensky has definitely lots of limits. One thing is sort of morally withstand what sort of the whole situation, what he went through. But again, you can't substitute resilience of this specific sort of way to handle matters with competence, with the right choice, and especially when there is a tunnel vision that sort of and or other sort of dependencies on this other figures that doesn't seem from either side something stemming from a good understanding of the situation. Zelensky's own psychological profile, which is extremely loyal to friends. This is something again, in some circumstances, of course, you would think this is a very positive thing, but this was, for example, evidenced by his 2014 sacrifice of 90% of Russian income rather than abandoning the group itself. And again, this is also a good indicator of some integrity from Zelensky. This is not simply saying, okay, the guy is corrupt. It's just corrupt for it's a forma mentis. It's some sort of cultural, personal, circumstantial, political consequence that goes in parallel, in fact, with the negative aspect of the inability to dismiss these friends, and difficulty recognizing when to withdraw, exacerbating the problem further, producing frontline outrage encapsulated in phrases such as "What are we fighting on for Yermak's golden toilets?" against a backdrop of perceived extravagance amid extreme hardship, of course. And this is especially a narrative that is quite punching in post-socialist, especially post-Soviet countries, where probably the elite is understood to be that sort of, not just corrupted, but severed from the rest of the population, which is also a bit of a, is an hyperbole, because of course it's always baked into the whole fabric of the country. But in at least amplificatory political and ideological sense, like this is a very punching thing in Ukraine. Independent Ukrainian commentators and Western observers, including those from the Atlantic Council, have highlighted how this cronyism has compounded mobilization failures and eroded public trust. With polls showing Zelensky's approval dipping below 50% for the first time since early 2022 amid the scandal, potentially weakening Kyiv's negotiation leverage as Russia exploits internal divisions to prolong the attrition war. This doesn't actually change the whole game. We will have now especially at the end, this sort of overall assessment of the situation. The point, as I already said, is mostly how this hits the Ukrainians morale-wise, probably moral resources-wise. All right, and this bond between government and the military is crucial, and the people, of course, like this is Clausewitz in wonderful trinity. Now, on the military level, let's get to the point. November 2025 has recorded the highest rates of soldiers leaving their posts without authorization or outright deserting of the entire war. Deputies such as Roman Kostenko and military bloggers state that such cases now equal or exceed the number of soldiers actually present at the front, with over 95% involving recently mobilized personnel. This, again, naturally you have to be relatively cautious about this, but the situation is that serious. There is a wave of discontent, of the demoralization and lack of purpose triggered by such political circumstances that is really disconcerting and incredibly dangerous. The Prosecutor General's office registered 21,602 new cases of desertion in October alone, right? I don't know if you realize what this is. Talking about the consistency of a force, it means that, say, half of the Ukrainian army is basically at risk of being sort of probably drastically depleted in a functionally organic sense, right, for military expendability proper. Commanders admitted at least 30% of the desertions go unreported. So basically, this should rise to something like 30,000 deserters in October alone, on an army of several hundreds of thousands. That, in this sense, it's not much the number in itself. It is what this means in a moral sense, right? It's not that to say, well, okay, these guys, if we take them out, the rest of the soldiers can fight alone. This is not the point. It's not like the soldiers are isolated. There is the guy that fully deserts and the other is fully committed. This is the symptom of a broader malaise within the Ukrainian army. Even elite units such as the 108th Da Vinci Wolves, separate assault battalion, and the French-trained 155th Anne of Kiev mechanized brigade. This is after the mom of Philip I of France. I also made a video about that recently. Reporting up to 1,700 soldiers absent without leave between March and November 2024 are affected despite last year's November amnesty allowing return without charges until January 2025, which naturally shows the also powerlessness of the authorities in general, both civilian and military, to cope with this issue. Prosecutors opened 162,500 cases of unauthorized absence from January to October 2025 alone. Over half of the war's total 311,000 such cases and 56,200 outright desertions since 2022, with reintegration efforts seeing 8,000 returns in November 2024, but new waves of up to 20,000 monthly absences in 2025, driven by fatigue, poor leadership, and inadequate training. Reports indicate that Ukraine's infantry crisis has deepened to brigade strengths at 50% capacity, contrasting Russia's 1.13 million active personnel compared to the 640,000 in Ukraine, right? Bolstered by prison recruits and mercenaries, as we know, forcing Kyiv, however, to offer $2,900 monthly incentives for 18 to 24-year-olds. This is the pay for volunteers at that point, because Ukraine is still resisting a draft age drop to 18 amid public backlash. This is also an aspect that, frankly, seems relatively, it's understandable, and especially you would think in this day and age. Ukrainians are very tough, right? It's very cynical to say, but this makes them great cannon fodder. If you have really received kick in the teeth for centuries, and you have lived as Ukrainians did under the Tsars, under the Bolsheviks, under that even Philip Putinian government for a while, the question is, you're not going to take this war lightly. You're going to go out there and exterminate the largest amount of people possible, right? Because it's written in your genes, really. It's not just Cossack blood. It's literally like what your entire mind is going to be up to in such circumstances. It's the full go. However, right, this is exactly the point. A more comprehensive strategy would have to explain why a drop in the age draft is quite relevant. It should be considered not just to dilute more certain specific. It's not even, you can make the trade-off, right, between the younger and the older, but at the same time, unless you don't plan really something that we don't, because we don't know what happens in the world in general from 4 months from now. You just plan to have the fresh youth that is genetically, biologically designed to kill and get killed, and the youngers are the best by far as soldiers, right? Not as commanders, obviously, but still, well, then there should be a sort of a bit of the acceptation of certain things. This, in an ideal system that, as we've seen, is eventually rigged by problems that are compound all together with the corruption. They're baked into that. This is simply another, I'd say it's one of the faces of this whole thing. I will not digress on it because it sounds cynical that would be not preferable, but say to send the youngers, but just to extend the draft age in a more uniform sense. Now, if you think about it, even just by scale, Ukraine, as we've seen, in a defensive posture, has more, obviously, the required, say, advised 1/3 compared to the adversary. All right, this is also largely a traditional warfare. But the point is that if we witness to these scales of desertion, by the way, in a condition right now that is not particularly, again, disastrous in an absolutely strategical sense. Like the situation is kind of bad, but there hasn't been a major punch at this point. It's been a major offensive, a major crack. Some section of the front has collapsed. No, there's none of that. These desertions are striking at a moment of relative stasis, and so they are very much due to internal problems rather than Russian aggression per se. It may seem strange, but again, the Russians haven't worn out, as we've seen, even properly certain sections of the Ukrainian manpower base. But in any case, the combination of inadequate training, and that's a problem for the country. I mean, the money, as we've seen, those 100 millions that were wasted in corruption, like they could have gone to training, to equipment that is currently missing. And above all, the perception of senseless orders, right, here is striking. Coming especially from an incompetent high command, collapsing morale in many formations, because in this case, at least in the officer cadre, there is a very strong awareness of what needs to be done. And as we've seen, the higher command is mostly connected to Zelensky's affiliations rather than people that would have better view. The demise of Zaluzhny was shameful, right? It was merely driven, in a sense, by personal incompatibility, even against the realization that he was by far the best man to handle the situation. There is also the strategic error of the late 2023-24 mobilization, showing that. Remember when the U.S. Congress had to vote for the arms to Ukraine, and in part they managed to compound that very delicate political situation just for electoral American reasons with not literally having not called the next wave of mobilization that Zaluzhny had urgently requested already in spring 2023 to be underway when public enthusiasm, by the way, remained high because the same Zelensky government hyper-bombarded us with the notion that we're going to make the counteroffensive. You should have not said anything about the counteroffensive, right? And Zaluzhny at that point properly disappeared. They literally didn't know where he was, or at least somebody knew, but in general, he refused to take part to that because in his estimate, the whole thing was being mismanaged. Not much the counteroffensive per se, but the entire strategical framework. This mobilization was specifically refused by a militarily inexperienced Zelensky, by the way, convinced that Western weapons alone would suffice and unwilling to lower the call-up age below 27 or assume political responsibility accordingly. All right, much could be said because I remember very well those times. We were at the last stages of Bakhmut. There was this again excessive propagandization of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. It's not like it hadn't to be done or even was useless. No, it did serve some purpose. It needed to be done, right? And it wasn't even disastrous in terms of actual losses. But the entire issue that the war could be ended in that moment was completely miscalculated, as well as properly deriving from this break with Zaluzhny that had instead informed, of course, the Ukrainian political guidance and sort of the militaries, the armed forces, that the situation was like it was. While he was abandoning, right? It was eventually the passage of honors, also with Zrisky and so on. Now, analysis from the Center for Strategic and International Studies underscores how this manpower shortfall, exacerbated by 120,900 desertions in early 2025, has shifted the war to Russia's favor in attrition, with Moscow's 670,000 committed troops outpacing Ukraine's reserves despite higher Russian casualties, nearly 1 million total, enabling incremental gains but at a rate of 150 losses per square kilometer, far, of course, below Blitzkrieg expectations. And by 2025, everybody was kind of aware what the pace of this warfare would have continued being. So the most strategically alarming development is occurring far from the Donetsk focus, on the Zaporizhzhia front instead, between Velika Novosylka and the city of Zaporizhzhia itself, where Russian forces are achieving the fastest territorial advance of the autumn-winter campaign, approximately 5 times quicker than around Pokrovsk. We're talking sort of ridiculous scale, but still, right? If this was an indicator of the war of attrition, we're witnessing, again, not to anything overly dramatic in the bigger picture, but still something that could sustain its pace against, by the way, almost exclusively territorial defense units with light weapons and the exhausted remnants of the 110th and 142nd Mechanized Brigades, of the Ukrainian army. Multiple narrow river lines intended as barriers have been crossed without difficulty, which indicates, of course, from the Ukrainian side a manpower issue. Russian mechanized and armored formations supported by special forces, including elements of the 36th Motorized Rifle Brigade, face minimal artillery or drone opposition, which is also disturbing because in a war of drones, so to say, to an extent, it's not about drones, but it's heavily accompanied by drones and that are using an ever more sort of saturating scale, even with some units carried out and actions carried out by drones themselves. For clearing terrain and marching on it, these guys are advancing without anybody sort of stopping them. Right? We've seen also in the previous video that the Russians are stepping up their drone production and surpassing the, at this point, more usual Ukrainian superiority we've seen during the war. Geolocated footage shows infiltrations into High and Danilivka, cutting the T-0401 Pokrovsk-Uliaipole highway, and Ukrainian forces have withdrawn from at least 5,000 villages under fierce pressure, with reports of prisoner of war executions near Uliaipole. This is naturally all too typical, especially for the sort of most embittered forces involved and all the ideological extremism of this invasion to begin with. Roughly half of Russia's frontline gains in the last 2 months have occurred around Uliaipole and Velika Novosylka, with advances of at least 30 kilometers over 6 weeks along a broad front. Again, it's kind of ridiculous if you really understand that this is a day of march of an army, typically. Per assessment from the Russian consultancy of the Institute of the Study of War, Zelensky visited the 128th Zakarpattia Brigade near Orikhiv on November the 13th, calling it one of the war's most difficult sectors, as Commander-in-Chief Alexander Syrsky admitted significant worsening, enabling potential outflanking of Zaporizhia's defenses from the north, and the threatening supply routes to the Dnieper, exploiting Ukraine's infantry shortages to position for 2026 offensives towards the oblast capital, that is 70 kilometers away, with minimal fortifications oriented against Crimean landings, so in the south rather than eastern thrusts. This is relevant because, of course, you can argue, and we will see this unfolding, that the Russians simply do not have the capacity to besiege a city like Zaporizhia, by the way, that is sort of big, right, and it requires, therefore, an enormous maneuver of actual surrounding. Like the Ukrainians would have some privileged capacities of sort of defense across the Dnieper passages, ways that the Russians can barely scratch. Again, it's something else. But if like this advances, as modest as they are, continue, there is going to be an erosion, if anything, of probably the Donetsk focus of the fort. And this is actually the riskiest aspect of the war, not even an outflanking of the Donetsk defenses and the belt of fortress cities. We're talking Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, and so on. You would say, but already the advancing Pokrovsk here is sort of trying to outflank those. Yes, but in a broader sense, if we're looking at the distribution of resources, the defense of other centers, there is a divarication, right, of the Ukrainian, probably strategic defense's direction that can in fact weaken the wall, and also sort of allowing the Russians, for that matter, to at that point cross into in between, where there is admittedly nothing but say relevant in a broader sense, but that's exactly because of this can enable sort of fastest maneuvers, at least to some extent. In the Novopavlivsk-Uliaipole sector, the collapse of the Ukrainian forces has been particularly abrupt. In fact, Russian units penetrated 10 kilometers into Ukrainian rare areas twice using equipment from the contested Grade Zone, landed 50-100 men near Novopavlivka, a feat unthinkable 6 months earlier, prompting desperate frontline commanders to plead for an end to counterproductive local counterattacks and drain already bled white brigades and for reinforcements to be sent to actual combat units rather than to assault groups at the expense of holding forces. In the Donetsk sector, the battle has become a textbook war of attrition, as we know, since late summer 2023, characterized by minimal maneuver, extremely slow frontal movement, and very high casualties on both sides. Evaluations from the CSIS and the Institute for the Study of War describe Russia's narrowed May 2022 objective to full control of Donbas via Kramatorsk's rail nexus after the loss of the northern logistical hub at Izium forced single-axis assaults from Donetsk against decade-old urban belts is yielding only 50 kilometers in 3 years and 250,000 fatalities, with 2025's losses of over 1,000 tanks, underscoring failed mechanized breakthroughs. This gives you properly a picture of the absurdity of Russia's advances at war. We're looking at Ukrainian resistance issue, and you would argue that that's exactly what they're trying to achieve, to wear out Ukraine. But this is not, again, a moment in which Ukraine is to collapse as a country, or even as properly armed forces. This is a moment in which there are some massive gaps surfacing, right? Massive issues materializing, but of course none of the two contenders having a capacity to deal properly that was a decisive blow to the opponent because of the mere fact conditions of these forces. From the Russian side, you realize what an army looks like after those losses. Ukraine's interdiction of supply routes has slowed, of course, the Russian tempo, mining roads and forcing foot logistics by groups of 2 or 3 men amid 50 to 20 kilometer so-called kill zones of drone threats. Berg Brigade reports turning the theater into a mutual exhaustion bet where timely Western aid could disprove Putin's outlasting theory. Now, Russia's strategic objective narrowed in May 2022 to full control of Donbass. This is what we're witnessing to. It's not a major master theory, grand strategy. People use the term grand strategy. There isn't such a thing like grand strategy. It's either strategy or not. This is just literally the redimensioning properly of strategic objectives to the full control of Donbass. This is exactly what the Russians are vying for at the moment. It's not like they don't hope Ukraine to be severely undermined and collapsing at some point. But again, we are not actually witnessing to this, even what was happening to the Ukrainian armed forces at the moment. With Kramatorsk, by the way, we mentioned it before, as the key demographic, administrative, and above all, rail node whose capture would render Ukrainian reconquest of Donbass logistically impossible, by the way. Again, you may never know what is going to happen on a front. At some point, armies collapse, right? And it can happen just like that. You don't have, it's not going to happen from a day to another, but once it happens, you can, in theory, sort of walk through everything. Now, this narrowed objective to full control of Donbass is theoretically to be achieved after, in particular, after the loss of the northern logistical hub of Izium by frontal assaults from the single remaining terminal at Donetsk against fortified urban belts built over a decade. Pokrovsk, as we know, is now effectively lost for the Ukrainians. Russian troops are inside the city, compressing the last organized Ukrainian units, including elements of the 38th Marine Brigade, into shrinking pockets where soldiers have reportedly survived on sweets for a week amid broken resupply promises. You don't want to even know what they look like. It must be something terrible and incredible. Ukrainian interdiction and mining have also largely forced Russian logistics onto foot by groups of 2 or 3 men, literally. And so we're looking at Russian advances. We're looking at this, right? As we've seen also in the aforementioned images, dense fog occasionally allows brief vehicle runs that are then punished, however, still by the Ukrainians. Assessments from the Institute for the Study of War confirms faster infiltration in Pokrovsk's west, reaching the 0515 highway, versus struggles in the east, with 150,000 troops employing so-called, I don't subscribe to such definitions, but the term of total infiltration by tiny groups after earlier mechanized assaults failed. Right, we've seen it in the past months. High losses, however, as we were saying before, that is 100 to 150 per square kilometer, so literally 50 per 20 meters, right, dotted in hundreds of bodies, and degraded units delay full seizure. Simultaneous probes in Siversk, southern suburbs, Liman, central areas south to Torska forests, Konstantinivka outskirts, Kupiansk, central areas reached there, and Chasiv Yar, northern moves to cut supply lines for encirclement without direct assault at this point, pressure the thinner post-Donbas belt. And per geolocated footage, this aims to bypass Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, via maneuver for supply denial seizures. And that's exactly what we're talking about before, namely the fact that these Ukrainian gaps are creating an incredibly dangerous condition where essentially some of the most important centers, again, and the defense of Donbas altogether could be at some point, not particularly soon, but by the rhythms of this war, definitely sooner than expected up to now, achieve that result without Ukrainians really being able to do much about it. Some say for this reason that the fortified Donbas belt has been largely overcome by the Russians. The next line would be markedly thinner, or at least it's actually not. But the idea is that given the current circumstances we just pointed out, it would be easier to overcome them. Ukrainian defenders hold each urban tactical objective only as long as the loss ratio remains favorable, so there is definitely a tactical advantage there. Then they withdraw to the next pre-prepared line deeper in the vast Ukrainian territory, say the 50 kilometers gained by Russia in 3 years, at least another 60 is still required to reach Kramatorsk from Donetsk, turning the entire campaign into a bet on which side collapses internally first is the actual point of this all. We're not even looking at, again, the territorial losses per se, it's just a fight between the two, but these broader bodies. There are analyses carried out by, I don't know, I hate the term, but this is the source of geopolitical futures, and the Atlantic Council frame this as Russia's shift from of course, the obvious initial intention to overrun Ukraine as a whole to mass attrition tactics, favoring quantity over maneuver amid 1 million casualties, vulnerable to Ukrainian battlefield air interdiction and deep strikes disrupting logistics, potentially forcing Moscow's overextension, especially if Western aid sustains Kyiv's 2025 reserves. Conversely, unresolved manpower gaps risk Ukrainian collapse by mid-2026. This is something I already said in the previous video, and the figure here is basically calculated literally by formulas that were created in World War I for attrition, for this kind of attrition strategies, and that, however, I sort of don't subscribe to. I mean, it's not like it's impossible, but say mid-2026 is not too far, but it's definitely going to show really, and worryingly so, some dynamics. I'm not talking just because of what happens at the Ukrainian battlefield, but in that sense, the international posture to this. If you want a sophisticated attitude to this, the point is we don't know really what is going to happen but in a few months from now, right, in a broader outline. When people say, but the wrong, again, assumption that Ukraine does not have actually enough soldiers, and this is allegedly a demographic issue, they're wrong as hell, right? The reason why these predictions, such as a mid-2026 Ukrainian collapse, are sort of completely hypothetical is that the problem actually of Ukrainian manpower is something much more shorter term, and it has to do with mobilization efforts, with all these broader political issues, and so it must be evaluated step by step, where you can't draw a trajectory and simply say, okay, we know that at this rate of losses Ukraine can't resist, because if you make actually only it is true that of course it's not the mere amount of losses, right? Ukraine could continue, I don't know, other 9 years with this kind of losses in strictly demographic terms. The problem is, again, what happens in between, and this is not a military thing. That is not how hard the Russians pound, because the Russians can pound just so hard and not more than that. The problem is what the hell happens within Ukraine. And again, today, this is say, when you study military history, you're habituated to ups and downs, right? You know that the moments of crisis is really impressive for everybody involved, and that people don't expect, there are sort of weird mind tricks, especially as external observer, but sometimes also by internally speaking. Think about, I don't know, well, I don't want to draw parallelisms, which now came out with an improper example, but that has nothing to do with the war in Ukraine, in fact. But in general, like the idea that there is a crisis and then there is a reaction to that and there is a way to remember that Ukraine here is backed by the West. It has full military, say, intelligence support. Again, economically speaking, we're supporting Ukraine. Western military production is decent, even though we don't have certain particular things available now to the extent we should. Nothing is actually that flattering as it sounds, but again, we're also looking at the Russians being in deep blip and still having just bodies to throw, together with, yes, drones and missiles, but again, to the extent that you can't win a war with drones and missiles. This is primarily about men, artillery, and a much more generalized effort that especially places an enormous burden, a disproportionate burden on the offensive, right? So I'm the first one to say that this is a pretty dramatic situation for Ukraine. We will, again, in the end, make some further consideration about this. But at the same time, the predictability of any outcome at this point it's not even just premature. We're not there yet to draw that conclusion, right? This is barely different than it was 1 year ago or 2 years ago, right? Now, on the night of November the 18th to 19th, Russian forces launched 40 KH, the Kinsal 101 7-caliber cruise missiles on one Iskander and ballistic missile and 476 drones, roughly 300 old sort of Shahed mosquito types, among the Shahed, Gerber, and other types, of which Ukraine downed 34 KH 101, all 7-caliber and 442 drones, which is not bad, right? It shows that actually, things keep sort of some pace. Again, what the Russians are doing from the other side is disproportionate, and so things are actually struggling, but still, right, things work to an extent that is acceptable. In any case, 7 missiles and 34 drones struck 14 locations, killing at least 26 civilians, which is not going to bring actually any favor to the Russians, nor militarily, nor morally, right? Including one KH-101 direct hit on a Ternopil apartment building with 26 still missing under rubble, by the way, and wounding at least 139. With disproportionate impact on civilian residential areas, public transport in Kharkiv is naturally close to the front, with 46 injured by 18 Geran 2/Shahed type drones. But even as far as the far west, with energy infrastructure across Lviv, Ivano-Frankivsk, Dnipropetrovsk, and Khmelnytsky oblasts, forcing emergency blackouts that have become nightly routine for weeks now. Reuters and BBC confirmed the Ternopil strike, one of Western Ukraine's deadliest, by the way, as targeting high rises with KH-101 missiles, killing 26, including 3 children, and injuring 93, of which 18 children, amid 48 missiles and 476 drones, again, overwhelming defenses at large. That's basically the point. It's a terroristic policy at the end of the day. Strikes, as we've seen, hit also Lviv with 3 injured, which 2 children, Ivano-Frankivsk with 3 injured, and Kharkiv with more, as we've seen, basically almost 50 wounded, destroying 2/5 of gas facilities and leaving millions in sub-zero darkness. per Naftogaz, part of Russia's pre-winter campaign to erode morale and logistics. Obviously enough, we are not new to this. Ukrainians know what happens this time of the year and why. But this never, of course, sort of cancels the shock, the trauma, the bitterness of this resolve. It actually hardens Ukraine's resolve. And again, it's happening all because at this point it's cruel, it's sadistic. It's there is this scandal. Ukrainians have a low morale, and this increases sort of the bitterness and the resentment. Financially, Ukraine requires at this point $30 to $40 billion immediately for pensions and salaries alone, rising to $130 billion over 2 years, while unconditional Western, especially US, willingness to cover these sums is visibly waning. This is an incredibly important aspect. There is, of course, the debate now for quite a while for finally seizing frozen Russian assets. That, however, as a decision faces insurmountable legal barriers and retaliation risks that could cost, for example, Belgium up to $180 billion. EU leaders pledged 2026-2027 needs coverage on October the 23rd, but deferred explicit endorsement of reparations loans due to Belgian concerns over Euroclear's 210 billion euros holdings. That is 90% of the G7's 300 billion euros total, opting for options. So they were called by December. Von der Leyen's 140 billion euros proposal, repaid via asset profits, has stalled on shared liability with Ukraine, urging unrestricted use for non-EU arms and repairs amid an 80 billion euros 2026 gap per the International Monetary Fund as a hold in US aid shifts the burden to Europe's 82 billion euros annual replacement requirement. Long-term arms deals such as the 17th of November's agreement for up to 100 Rafale fighter aircraft over 10 years, plus drones and air defenses, or the patchwork of 95 F-16s up to 150 Gripens and Mirage 2000s appear increasingly detached from operational reality on Ukraine's solvency prospects beyond 2026, creating a logistical nightmare of 8 different combat aircraft types when the Air Force already struggles to maintain a few dozen legacy MiG-29s and Sukhoi 27s. Zelensky hailed the Rafale letter of intent signed with Macron as historic for regenerating Ukraine's Air Force with F-4 variants, SAMP/T surface-to-air missile batteries, radars and missiles potentially co-produced locally between France and Ukraine. Echoing October's Gripen Pact, up to 150 E-models by 2035 funded via frozen assets, it triples Kyiv's Western fleet ambitions amid Mirage F-16 teething issues, but experts note, of course, decade-long timelines clash with 2025 attrition needs, risking a zoo of incompatible platforms without major additional funding, but more in particular, spending an enormity just for a situation that requires, as we've seen, a much sort of more serious handling, starting properly from the political standpoint and then addressing the broader Ukrainian strategy in the war. So this is an incredibly risky moment, especially as far as not much arms supplies per se, because we're talking aircraft, it's relatively secondary, but mostly the sustainability of the continuous financial support, which naturally is compounded with the military production, and that may cause significant issues. These are normally resolved. If you look at where we were at the beginning of the war, we didn't even hurry at that point. And so what we're doing right now seems to be, of course, relevant, but it still has a lot to do with how we see Ukraine doing. Not to say that we're not going to defend Ukraine, whatever happens. On the contrary, if things start going worse, actually, at that point, there is going to be another surge of actual and sort of more thorough support. But we also need, for Ukraine's victory, the same country to change pace on certain specific aspects. And it is mostly a political issue. It's not much. So much could be done with very few changes at the top. Because, again, potential is there. It's not like we lack that. We lacked it in Europe. We lack it in Ukraine. This is actually one of the, historically, and I've said this on multiple occasions, it's one of the most sort of typical moments in which Western struggles end with triumphal victories, if properly handled, because there aren't many other circumstances of that kind. When we talk about sort of what should be enlightened elites that quite aren't, but it's not like from the other side of the barricade there is any of such that. And a people in search for redemption from a much deeper sort of historical background. So if you combine what the West has been and what Ukraine has been, there is a fantastic result that can be achieved. And this was admittedly something that should have been done in any case, at a much more direct level and a much faster pace since the very beginning of the war, right? But it doesn't mean that we can't sort of get there if Ukraine does keep fighting the way it does. So interference in Ukrainian affairs, as we've seen also with the same investigations, were sort of controlled by the West itself, seem opportune and painfully necessary. The point is realizing that there is a massive war being fought, and that the system, although supplied, is also incredibly delicate. And especially when you look at some core issues, you must address those as quickly as possible. Otherwise, you can't simply recuperate later. Fortunately, again, the Russians are, in pretty disastrous conditions themselves, but they're still the stronger side, and they are because they, for them, it costs less to go on so clumsily. But at some point, it doesn't matter how costly it is for them. In fact, the system will also slow down to a degree by which, as we've seen, even just by objective, like they don't reason anymore. The simple conquest of Ukraine, the simple destruction of Ukraine, simple, capitulation of Ukraine, or the collapse of its front, right? It's something different. In any case, back to Ukraine, amid this systemic fragility, on November the 19th, Western media reported a US-Russian draft 28-point so-called peace plan, drafted by advisors Howard Witkoff and Kirill Dmitriev, requiring Ukraine to withdraw from remaining Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, cap its military at current strength, abandon key weapon categories and long-range systems capable of striking Russia, prohibit foreign troop deployments, make Russian an official language, grant official status to the Kremlin-controlled Moscow Patriarchate, and accept a demilitarized zone in evacuated Donbas areas while freezing the southern front line with only vague Russian withdrawals, quote, subject to negotiation. So in practice, and this is why media is ridiculous in this, this is BS. All right, there is not Trump behind the scenes doing anything. This is just essentially Trump trying to be in the fray still and coming up with these statements, sort of as they are being let out, if anything, by the allegedly secretly negotiating sources for evident political reasons. All right, so this thing is unfeasible. It was never actually on the table. And in fact, I read here from my information agencies that, of course, Zelensky is saying, oh, well, yes, now we act as if Trump is moving. Nothing is actually happening, right? This is just, okay, we have now to cope with this novelty. And, in a few weeks, we won't even be talking about this anymore, likely, right? I personally doubt that there is anything bigger or something that can be accepted by Ukraine, even at this point. In any case, it doesn't seem something practically feasible. In any case, there has to be still much fighting before any of these conditions can be met. There is no air of peace. There is not any any precondition. You were Russia, you would go on for now, because after all, that's been the point of it all, right? What would Ukraine get in all this? Because the pact realizes that this would be unacceptable for Ukraine. So as always, there is this fact that in exchange Ukraine would receive unspecified U.S. security guarantees, and we don't know which ones they are. I mean, everything is possible in line of principle, but it's just not credible at the moment for any of this to be, happening. Like political analysts, also strategic analysts said that basically by autumn 2025, some sort of agreement would be reached of some sort. It was likely, right? But it was one of those predictions that, again, you can't have, especially since they were around in spring. I believe myself that things were sort of winding down, and they technically are to some extent, because as we've seen, the two contendants are exhausted in each own regard, and there is not much of a point, apparently, a positive achievement other than, again, seizing, for example, as we were saying before, Ukraine's eastern fortresses line and all that kind of thing. But again, it's not like you get Ukraine in that way. Leaks about this alleged agreement or like plan detailed the framework building on August 25 Alaska talks that were as icy as Alaska, temperature-wise. I mean, literally, the Alaska talks, basically, it seems like Trump and Putin didn't even talk to one another behind the scenes. They just were cold silent, where it was just a ridiculous display that Trump needed objectively, because I think that Trump did mostly say he could do much better, especially with more delicacy at some point. But, he has his style, and I don't complain in general about, say, his broader presidency. There are some things that are 30% that are debatable. But in any case, he needed to show the world that he was negotiating with Putin, even though this was obviously not happening, because there's nothing to negotiate. This is what the entire point of why this war is being fought. It's not the Ukrainians saying no. It's just literally the war, two sides. It's the West saying no. It's the Russians saying no. There is nothing else but this thing to go on, right? And so this leaks apparently refer to a coverage of Ukraine's future, European security, U.S.-Russia ties, with Dmitriev optimistic as, quote, Russia's position is heard, which is just basically the usual nonsense, to show that the Ukrainians, mostly, or the Russians even more, that things are, Russia's not isolated, that there is an agreement, things are better. But in fact, the same Kremlin, first of all, rejects confirmation. Witkoff briefed Defense Minister Rustem Umerov, but excluded EU input, alarming allies like Germany's Friedrich Merz over capitulation risks. As Zelensky's cancelled meetings in Turkey and uncertain talks with U.S. generals suggest sabotage of Kyiv's independent diplomacy, if anything, amid pressure from the incoming U.S. administration. This is not much a military issue, it's a political one, right? It's just showing that you're negotiating with Russia, and obviously at that point you can't have, this was Trump's position all along, right? You can't be, you're from Ukraine's side. It's not like the US are throwing Ukraine under the bus. It's not their strategic interest by any stretch of the imagination. But it's like saying, we have to be neutral, because when we deal with the Russians, we have to make them believe at least that we're treating them as equals, because it's just like in their narrative of the West, the entire West against, which is actually just America in this case, which in any case is the most powerful actor in any case, and the Russians themselves. So this is the usual 2022 Istanbul thing, right? It simply reprises Russia's demands presented when Russian forces threatened Kyiv back then, unchanged despite Ukraine subsequently liberating over half the seized territory and forcing Russia into slower traditional offensives. Sitting the remainder of Donetsk would do nothing but to hand Russia the decade-old fortress belt and vital defense industrial logistical hubs without cost, sparing Moscow years of effort and enabling future renewed aggression from far more advantageous lines toward Kharkiv, Zaporizhzhia, Dnipro, or across the Oskil River. while a frozen southern front would allow Russian reconstitution for later pushes against Kherson or Zaporizhia cities, precisely the objectives Moscow continued to claim, at least in a broader ideal sense, whereas we've seen the strategic goals now have narrowed down drastically and dramatically. So in other words, this is the obvious reason why this war keeps being fought, and why, of course, Russia's narrative and demands do not change, because they do not literally matter, right? They perfectly know they're not going to get any of that, nor from the West, nor from Ukraine. And as such, what is still to be seen is who lasts, the longest. That's simply it, right? And that's what this war has always been about. And there is no other real historical, political, moral perspective in this. It's all very clear. There aren't other narratives. There aren't the isolationistic, branches of the MAGA sabotaging Ukraine. It goes on even without you. It's don't worry. You live in a civilization. Lesser people do not have any control on such things, and thank God there is no such thing like equality between people. And power manifests is what really counts. Now you would argue, well, but in this video we have seen how Ukraine is suffering at this point. Yes, but as I also said, there is a crisis. There is not a complete collapse, right? Crisis is dangerous because from those fixtures, an actual collapse could come. But it's not like this war has been, picking flowers along the way. It's been a continuous fixturing of both sides' capacities because of the massive bloodshed that we have all witnessed. And it's just something shocking in and of itself to witness. Not much it in itself. I mean, from a military historical perspective, you're not really surprised by much, but it's rather the nonchalant attitude of most of the world toward this, and the fact that there doesn't seem to be a political acumen to realize how to handle this whole thing since the beginning. It's difficult. This is also totally normal within civilization, within all big systems. You don't simply make things work without resistance, without friction, without this also self-sabotage. It's all completely normal. The more wars you study, the more you realize that the narrative that it was just one block against one other, that never really was, right? But that's why it is really dangerous what happened in Ukraine right now, because from one side, it shows how wars are, let's say, on the battlefield, there is an actual consequence for this crisis. But at the same time, it's not caused essentially by the military dimension. It's caused by the political dimension, social dimension. I don't want to even enter, of course, say, imagine those people who do not come back to the front. Who are they? Where do they sleep? Like, how does the system work, right? They are probably, as we've seen, sanctioned. They are, in some cases, arrested, etc. But it's more like these people reflecting pretty darn hard on what they have seen at the front, what they know about their society, what they know about their military, what they know about their politics. It's something terrifying, right? Think about this when you go to sleep at night. That, you living in a country where it's not like, things end and, I'm fine. Like, at least, well, maybe somebody else comes to rule over me. No, everything you have is going to be erased. You have no place to fall back on. Or at least you have, but outside of your country, outside of your home, outside of everything. This is terrible. All right, so it's just something that Ukrainians, per se, just because their country was invaded, would not sort of accept. They would prefer to die. But the main issues in the conduct of the war has been exactly the way this potential has been spent. And Zelensky made it abundantly clear. These desertions make it abundantly clear. Right? There isn't a generalized sentiment of we don't want to fight for Ukraine. It's more like we want to fight for a corrupted government and for especially incompetent leadership. Today's video maybe should have addressed this as well. We've done it also in other videos, but how do Ukrainians fight? Again, the problem is that Zelensky in particular seems to have this idea that continuous, relentless counterattacks. For what? You're fighting a defensive war, right? focus on defense, focus on something less sort of retaliatory and more sort of long-term, right? These counterattacks are ridiculous. They waste men, they waste fuel, they waste ammo, and that's the stupidest thing you can do in absolute terms. It is true that war must be fought also with counteroffensive. Actually, like the only reason why you fight on the defensive is counteroffensive, but it's something that must be properly timed in a broader picture, not on localized counterattacks just because, I don't know, those guys have advanced a little bit. It doesn't matter. It's not like if Russians advance 10 kilometers, they will arrive to Kyiv in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. The most important thing is that you preserve your own manpower and you stop them halfway, and you can even regain the initiative if you manage at some point, for some whichever political reason in Russia, this thing start faltering, and the Russians simply stop, wanting this at least to the point that probably no point to it is seen, even at the front lines, especially the front lines. We've seen that was sort of rampant desertion among the Russians as well. So none of this is new. None of this is strange. It's all seen and it's all explainable. All right. Now, the Institute for the Study of War warns that the plan we are seeing that in any case is, I personally, like in these days, I've interpreted just like a joke and as the usual deal that is not a deal at all, would favor obviously Russia by granting Donetsk hubs vital the fortress belt defense in 2014 without compromise, enabling multi-front threats like the Oskil crossing for Kharkiv encirclement or Zaporizhia reconstitution, echoing again Istanbul's unchanged maximalism despite Ukraine's 50% territorial recoveries and Russia's foot-paced advances. So to me, it's a big no. It's just not an option, right? It never was. It's not going to be now, right? This thing, if anything, seems to be timed exactly with this alleged moment of perceived Ukrainian weakness, so that the Russians always try to exploit that, just because they're desperate themselves. They don't know how or when this country will collapse. They just probably smile at the current Ukrainian gaps and withdrawals, but they know that that's not strategically an indicator that the war is to be won, that the Ukrainian army is collapsing as a whole. It's an unprecedentedly dangerous situation for Ukraine, but one that still strategically holds ground. And so also politically speaking, you unless there's going to be, a collapse of the Ukrainian government in a statal sense, which is not going to happen, and especially at this moment, the strategic option will always be expendable, even in this circumstances. Putin's outlasting theory persists via the 2025 670,000 troops, but timely Western aid and economic pressure could again reverse attrition dynamics. There is no doubt about this. It already happened, it can keep happening. There haven't been fundamentals that haven't been particularly changed. It's normal, again, to have this sinusoid trend, this ups and downs. This is just showing the greater tiredness, the greater exhaustion. Right? The problem is deep, but it's not essentially military. It is political. It's more dangerous in a sense, but it has been uncovering an exquisitely political scandal with a moral impact on the people, and the problems of how Ukrainians are sent into combat in specific counterattacks that do not yield anything is a long time problem that now at this point is being it's been exacerbated by all this. It's going probably to bring to some change, unless some crackdown happens or some stubbornness occurs. The Americans, the Europeans are following closely everything. So anything like a revolution or whatever, it doesn't seem anything on the horizon. It would be detrimental. But there is in fact a much more a civilized way to fix this, especially if Zelensky sort of understands that this kind of political chronism cannot really go on anymore. It's ridiculous. It's anachronistic. It makes you look like a Russian, frankly, and that would be enough for having it stop. From Russia's side, the plan rests, let's say, this horizon, like on Putin's unchanged theory of victory, that Russia can outlast Western support and Ukrainian resistance. And that's probably the greatest mistake that Russia made. The Russians do not understand the West. They have no clue. They are an inferior culture. They do not have the tools to understand West. Putin, admittedly, if you have ever heard any speech of his, any discussion, he does not understand the concept of Western pluralism. To him, it's just like if you don't have a single head in a rigidly uniformed and autocratically oppressive system, like you can't work, right? That's all he knows. He does not have any other horizon. He does not understand that the inherent superiority of the West under any political, military, and social dimension is exactly opposite to what he pretends. It's the typically paranoid, undereducated Russian that does not want to accept to be part of an inferior culture. And you have to understand that. I mean, this guy had, his brother killed by the Nazis in St. Petersburg. I mean, who cares? Like the Nazis could kill, Putin's parents that they were there. Frankly, it would have been, and likely they killed many Putin's parents in that. And so it's not like sympathizing in general for Nazis' sort of motivations in an absolute sense, but you understand that there are reasons for things, and these reasons are pathetic, objectively. And you just should feel ashamed from coming from a country like that, and just remaining into it to fix anything if possible. Instead, here we are, right? Naturally, there are bigger reasons for all this, but it's not. It's basically the fact that Russia is dying as a power, as a country. Siberia is going to be lost to China historically. Like Russia, without Ukraine, does not have even a chance of surviving in a broader sense. This is not a justification. This means that your country is fucked up beyond repair. That you have to invade another to save yourself. This is typical again of underdeveloped systems. We've seen it very much in all other eras. And the systems do end badly. The problem is that at the time, between the other years, you didn't have the second largest nuclear arsenal in the world, and this changes a little bit things, but doesn't surely break the West, or in this sense also Ukrainian resolve. That is high, it's not high in the moment because of, unfortunately, the political scandal, but it's not lowered by just some changed attitude towards Russia per se, right? So it's this. We are definitely still in time, and we always underestimate ourselves as Westerners. We're still in time and sufficient in energy, in resources, in power to aid Ukraine, combining all the necessary pressures on Russia, and so again. Confidently, Ukraine has not lost the war, and that's actually the only thing that matters. Ukraine can even win, and I'm sure that this is just a momentary issue, that even if something else will happen in the future, for which unfortunately things will go worse, it will have not been decided by any of this yet, right? So this may not help for sure, but again, Ukraine lost, Ukraine is falling, no, we're not there, right? This is not the moment in which that is. This is more like a massive moral blow that, however, has to be conducive to a radical change who could truly, at that point, turn the tides. But it's very difficult, and so the risk of further stagnation, destruction, etc., but not even collapse at that point, because we don't have an actual mean to calculate, to predict that, is great. 2026 gaps in the front line because of desertion, because of recruitment issues that make the front collapse. In theory, again, mid-2026, unfortunately, is possible. But do we have a likelihood for this? Like saying, this is what we really invest on or count on? No, we're not there. We don't see it. And even though it may well happen, it's definitely something which really has a lot in between before it takes place. This shouldn't make us rest on it. The following weeks, months are going to be crucial in many ways. So this may really be a moment, a turning moment, for better or for worse. I have, let's say, from this year, I have matured a slightly different opinion on this war, not in a political sense or sense of allegiance, but in a military sense. There is something is showing up, and unfortunately, it's bad news for Ukraine. But again, it's not indicative of an imminent collapse, and we can absolutely be sure of this. From the Russian side, it's usually like, it's just pressing a button and continuing to stress Ukraine, to oppress Ukraine, but there isn't any better, jolly card they can play for breaking through. They don't have that. All right, so here more than ever is in the hands of the West and of Ukraine. The confluence of military collapse in previously stable sectors, an unprepared energy system, high-level corruption eroding the last domestic trust, soldiers leaving their posts in numbers reaching parity with frontline presence, and the evident drying up of unconditional Western aid has generated extreme systemic fragility in Ukraine. Never been so close, all right? And there is even this notion of, it's very different narrative. We've seen it also in the video about the Freikorps War, but the explicit historical parallel to the 1918 German stab-in-the-back Legion, which was mostly like something attributed to the jury, as we explained there, where actually the German high command had tried to run a background check to officialize it, and it turned out actually that the German Jews were disproportionately present in the front line and were fighting like lions. And so they had to destroy it, they had to conceal that evidence. Here it's different. By the way, in 1918, Russia had been knocked out of the war, and so that's also an interesting parallel, but of course it's a very different situation. An army still on foreign soil, undermined by a home front that suddenly lost faith in its leadership. This mostly, like, the foreign soil is, in this case, Russia, right? And in Germany, they were defending on foreign soil in Flanders, and so it's different, relatively different. However, one dreadful similarity with that is that producing, say that this collapse was something, we've seen also in the videos about the Kaiserschlacht in 1918, due not much to the suddenly lost faith in its leadership. In part it was that, and it was probably the actually most important factor, but it was also really a matter of outstretch of resources. In Ukraine, we are not in the same situation. And so Germany had really arrived at the bottom of the barrel, scrapping the last resources of the country. Here, Ukraine is in a completely different situation. So we shouldn't overly dramatize, right? An implosion without classic battlefield defeat would actually happen with a counteroffensive, with the Kaiserschlacht, and one from which probably manpower would never recover. Is again something extremely different from what Ukraine is doing now. As we've seen, there are some large swathes of Ukrainian male able-bodied population that has not even been touched, probably the youngest, and so the best soldiers in expendable terms. There are forecasts, and again, I don't much believe in forecasts by method of historical analysis, especially in sort of longer-term scenario. But the GlobSec has the 2025-2026 scenarios with 31% probability for prolonged attrition, which is consistent because the other scenarios entail mostly other things, right? They indicate, in any case, Russian gains via manpower superiority. Again, 1.13 million versus Ukraine's shortages. However, with a battered army that is sort of organically inconsistent for any major sort of strategic move, warn of possible 2026 elite fractures if Western 82 billion euros annual aid sustains Kyiv interdiction capabilities, which, is something relatively debatable. In this sense, potentially, however, forcing Moscow's overextension. Conversely, unresolved gaps risk Ukraine collapse by mid-2026 per at least the CSIS, unless Europe activates its 200 billion frozen assets for euros assets for reparations loans by the second quarter of 2026, which definitely shows that there is a wide margin, right? We're talking almost essentially 3/4 of a year of full game still active, and mostly looking at the potential collapse of Ukraine not happening through any Russian breakthrough, but essentially through some sort of cascading effect in this exacerbation of desertion and manpower shortages, recruitment, mismanagement, all this stuff. So whether Ukraine avoids the same fate in the coming weeks hinges solely on the speed, depth, and credibility of corrective measures, if anything, remain possible. And we shouldn't absolutely think that they're not capable of handling it. Also because we're all into it. And so remember that the pendulum always swings. As I said, this is completely habitual in life, in any circumstance. When you feel at the lowest, just know that if you can't always get worse at some point. And it will at some point, unfortunately. But that moment, the way you feel in that moment, it's transient. It's an illusion. There is a specific reason, and naturally there must be ways to fix it. And those ways are difficult, especially in this case, and where we look at big systems. But it is also something that there are known fixes for. Like, it's not like we don't know what to do or how to do it. It requires understanding. It requires will. More attention, more will, more sort of accountability of the same. However, the overall scenario is obviously more complicated for everybody involved, and it's not even like you can say simply this is an isolated system. Again, I don't make predictions myself because it doesn't make any sense. But this is what is happening in Ukraine, and it's been somehow sobering and eye-opening to realize this, that there is an evident, palpable weakening, sort of increasing systemic weakening of Ukraine, especially her armed forces, due to a specifically political, moral issue connected with a scandal of how the country was run. So it is something shocking, but it is not, again, intrinsically, let's say, the indicator of an imminent collapse of some sort. You can say that this shock was due to the fact that the entire system, including the military, as we've seen, is badly run. It's all about the top. Leadership is important, especially in war, to the utmost extent. Let's see now what happens, though. Because, again, it's not like a collapse effect. The front line is collapsed. No, we're not there, right? There just has to be a change. And we don't know what the measures that will be taken would look like. And Russia, frankly, is not faring well either. This video was naturally mostly based on this Ukrainian side of the story. It is mostly designed to provide with a wake-up call for anyone involved. But remember that Viz on the other side is not achieving really what they what they thought at the beginning to minimally be able to achieve. And this is, again, incredibly irrelevant, because it's not like Ukrainians are fighting against an imaginary enemy. Their system is just their own problem. It's something which has withstood, again, a power that was deemed to be crushing, and giving Ukrainians a reason to fight that here, I would say, is actually being displayed as a very mature sort of protest against how their government has been running things. And even though we can always say that everything is baked into the cake, that of course this is a Ukrainian problem as a whole. It's not just a matter of government. This is a system that obviously is, provides with a share for, abuse within, different compartments of the whole system and so on. Still, there is the understanding that things have to change, and there is more than enough people in Ukraine today that know exactly what is needed in order for this change to happen. All the rest is more like rhetoric. For the rest, I don't want, as I said at the beginning, to make a political commentary here. This is mostly just registering a greater volatility of Ukrainian defenses, which is not good. It is actually terrible, but it is not the end. All right. Some say it could be the beginning of the end. You never know in history what the beginning or of something in particular is. Crisis does not mean defeat. Like, war is constellated by crisis. And so this is valid for everybody. It's always two adversaries that constantly influence one another. Let's see at this point what Ukraine can do, and also what are the actual limits of Russia in this sense. Because if we look at the situation, it's not like, again, they're particularly capitalizing in dramatic terms. They're just creeping in faster than they usually did, but still by metrics that are objectively absurd. Again, in Pokrovsk, there are some 50 meters where 1,200 people were casualties or killed, if I'm not wrong. So we're talking doesn't matter, because by scale it's basically there in the same way. That alone, that proportion alone is terrifying, right? That proportion alone is like, what the hell are you even doing, right? What are you trying to achieve? This is pure desperation. It's not a strategy. It's not a broader, oh my God, they're making it because they know what they are failing badly since the beginning, and they're just protracting this mess, trying to crush a country that is actually pretty big, that is not, again, on the verge of collapse, and that can compress due to these actual issues, but remains sustained by the Allies. And even though, again, we said that the Westerners have become more hesitant because of all this, of the scandal in particular, there is a way to surpass that. And and Europeans understand that. West understands this at large. For example, I see here it's a very recent news that Germany has officially confirmed that preparations have begun to send long-range Taurus missiles to Ukraine. Right. So according to Friedrich Merz, the technical consultations with Ukraine, which had been ongoing for several months, are now nearing completion. Merz stated that the Ukrainian military will be equipped with these systems, but the delivery timeline and number of missiles, of course, to be transferred remain classified. Again, this is very timely, as much as there is a crisis. Because as Germans, we respond by saying, okay, we'll finally send the Taurus that, as you know, was kind of an object of contention, also because the Russians, of course, did not want it, because it's the umpteenth red line that the West crosses. Of course, nothing happens, as always. We have learned this game. It's so stupid. Like, we're facing an incredibly, sort of undeveloped enemy. He should be easy to take on if we make a minimal effort to address all what needs to be addressed. It costs, but it's fully within, the cost of so much that we normally spend for, but nobody whines about. So this has always been the point. Let's simply remain vigilant. Let's sort of hurry slowly, or at least hurry, consistently, one thing at a time, orderly, clearly, rationally, with a vision, with a strategy, with cooperation, with effectiveness. This is essentially what needs to be done. All the rest, right, this is not like a guarantee of victory. It's a guarantee, however, that you will have done essentially all you could do. And we know that at that point, this is actually a guarantee of victory. What the world goes, then, like, it's another thing. This, however, is because it depends on us. Again, too much about this last aspect. Again, today's video is not, as you've seen, even properly the usual one with all the sections, with the maps, whatever. It was mostly dedicated to this kind of issue. If you want, I can make soon properly an analysis of the various frontline situations, some sort of more technical stuff. The only copyright commercially expandable map that I had was the, surely as always on Wikimedia, on the main Wikipedia page of Russian offensive, you had the updated map day by day. It wasn't overly precise, but it was the best we could use, and it was effective in any case. It wasn't precise in a hyper sort of detailed tactical fashion, but strategically it was clear. And instead I saw today, when I was preparing the images for this video, that they stopped it at September. So I didn't want to use the same map of September, because of course things have changed. Unfortunately, it's speedier than we thought. But in any case, also minimally in that sense. So more or less we know what we're looking at on the map. I think I imagine that they will update the map once again, and it will be expandable, right? For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time.